I hope that Vietnam will be put into perspective. I think that for many reasons that's what he is remembered for those people who were growing up in the 60s. I think it was a time of turbulence, and I think it was not just Vietnam, it was civil rights, it was women coming coming into the mainstream in professional ways, a lot of things. It was this spirit of individualism. And while Daddy was very much for individualism, and he was certainly an individual himself, he appreciated more then than some the importance of collective goodwill, that sometimes we had to think of what is best for all of us and not just for me. And I'm reading a book right now, Bob Putnam's book about, it's called Bowling Alone, and it's talking about how we've become so disconnected. And I would love to have him here to talk about it, because I think that the kinds of things he was talking about was how can we educate and get good health care for the individual so they can make the collective stronger. It was not, say, favoring blacks or African Americans or people of color, whatever you want to say. It was really, how can we empower them to live up to the best that they can be so that they can empower those around them, how collectively we can be better. And if you're not allowed to get a good education, or if you're not allowed to have the kind of health care, then everything kind of falls down. And as a society, we're not as strong. So I would like to think that he will be remembered for how he tried to make this country a better place than he found it, to look at some of the things that were not giving us all the opportunities, for women also, not just for people of color. And he always told me that I could do anything or be anything. And I worried sometimes because, he didn't have a son. And I think in some ways, although he never ever said, "I wish you had been a man," I've always felt a little like how unfair for this person not to have a son to carry on his name, to do that. And I guess it was just God's good judgment that a son would have a more difficult time with Daddy, because I was his daddy's darling daughter, his 3D girl. And I think it probably would have been very difficult for a son with as dynamic a person as my father was. And I hope that in succeeding times that people will look back on Vietnam and see that he was trying to do what he thought was right with the information that he had. And hindsight is frequently better to judge. You have to go with the information you have right now, and you have to see the counterbalancing, because I heard him talk often about how there were people who were very conservative, who were trying to push him into using, dropping the bomb and obliterating people. And he was struggling to try to fulfill our commitments that he believed we had to these people. And also there was a question, I think, maybe this is just my judgment, that there might have been a little racist attitude with some of those people who didn't really think that our men and women, and it was mostly men then, lives were worth it for these people with slanted eyes. That maybe if we had been fighting for people in in Europe, trying to keep a treaty there, that they might have seen it differently. And so in some ways I think there was also he looked at discrimination even through in that context. But I know that with the people I'm working with now in college students who are in their 20s, 30 years plus, weren't born when Daddy was president, and even their parents don't really have very many memories that they've given to their children, that maybe with time Vietnam will be put into a context, a different context, and I hope so, because he certainly did feel that his that so many of the things that he loved were being damaged, or we weren't going as far as we could. They were things we could have done if we had been able to if we didn't have Vietnam and that pain.
How well did you get to know President and Mrs. Kennedy?
Not well. I remember going to Boston to, I guess it was a debate, it was a joint event with both of them, with Daddy and with then Senator Kennedy, and then I took along a paperback copy of Profiles in Courage. I had read the book, and it was wonderful. I loved history, and I'd read the book. And I asked him to sign it, and Senator Kennedy signed it. Who knows whatever happened to the book? I mean, I am just sick that I can't find it. The Kennedys were always very kind and invited us to do things. Mind you, I was, in 1960, I was still in high school. I was, I guess, starting, just beginning to be a young lady. And let me just say, go on to say one thing about Dick Russell we were talking about, and using that, a young lady. My father once said to Dick Russell, he said, Lynda is becoming a young lady. And Dick Russell, ever the gentleman, kind of straightened up and said, Lynda has always been a young lady. Maybe only Dick Russell saw that, but anyway, it was very tender. But the Kennedys invited us to come to several things that particularly were with other children, other young people. And I had met Mrs. Kennedy. I remember sitting with her on a step at the Capitol. I think her husband had given away his tickets to, I can't remember if it was the State of the Union or some event at the Capitol. And my father had given his away. And so both of us ended up sitting on the steps in the gallery watching this event. And we talked then, so I got to know her when she was a Senate wife. But she was closer to my age than she was to Mother's. She was such a very young woman. And I have a beautiful letter that she hand wrote to me. I wish I had gotten to know them both. I was just as enamored of President Kennedy as most people, and Mrs. Kennedy told my mother, I understand, that he liked me too. So that was wonderful. But I was going to tell you the story. Harriet asked about the 1960 convention. And I had gone out there with Carolyn Kellum, Jesse Kellum's daughter. She was kind of my buddy, and we had gone out to California to the convention. And Lucy was a little bit younger, and I don't remember if she had anybody. I think the Wesley Wests were kind of watching over her. But Carolyn and I had a room that was right on the suite with my parents. And sometimes people would go through our room to get to their rooms because they didn't want to go outside. You know, the press and everybody would be outside in the hall, and so they would just kind of use our room as a walk-through. So we had lots of people coming through our room. But now, let me ask you, if I tell you a story, can we not put it, can we just hold it in abeyance?
Certainly.
Oh, I was going to tell this story. Okay. This is the first kind of scary thing that happened to me. We were in the Biltmore Hotel, and Daddy's, his room that he had for his volunteers and people he was recruiting was down this hall, and you had to walk up these steps and into this little small ballroom. And as a matter of fact, a few years ago, I went to the Biltmore Hotel, and I remembered exactly where these rooms were. I just remember so well where it all was. And I went back to see that ballroom, and it's still like it was. Well, anyway, we had all these lovely ladies dressed up in these red, white, and blue outfits, ladies for Lyndon. And we had little lamb's kisses, I think they were, toffee kind of things, that had on them, you know, love that Lyndon, or kisses for Lyndon or something, I don't know. Well, I was down there, and you know, I would go down there and kind of greet delegates and talk to everybody, and that was one of the things that I did as a young person when my parents would have constituents. You know, I'd go up to the Capitol and the Senate office building on weekends. That was my playground. That was, you know, we didn't have malls, and that's where I would spend my time, and particularly in the summer. So when we had constituents that would come, I would be asked to take them around. You know, Mother was busy, and Daddy, of course, was on the floor, but I could take them around to all these special places. So I was kind of used to being the hostess. So I was greeting people in California and telling them that I was Senator Johnson's daughter. And I left there and went back to my room. Well, to come back, go to my room, I had to go down these steps and then walk through the hall. And Senator Kennedy's hospitality room was right there on the hall. And this man came out, and he grabbed a hold of me and was, you know, didn't know me, but, you know, it was, honey, give me a kiss, and, oh, you're a Johnson person, and he was very obnoxious, and I really felt threatened. I was scared. I mean, I didn't know what he was trying to kiss me. He had his arms all over me and groping and all of that, and I was really scared. And I kind of thought about the repercussions, how it would have played in the paper if, instead of just trying to beat him off and try to get help, if I had made something of it. Because in fact, I don't think, you know, he wasn't anybody who worked for Jack Kennedy or was anybody who I think was particularly close. He was probably just a supporter who'd had too much to drink. But it was in the middle of the day. And you know, I was just a scared little girl. And I sometimes wonder, you know, if I had screamed and caused a lot of attention and told him who I was, that he was attacking the daughter of Jack Kennedy's competitor, how that would have, you know, how that would have played. But fortunately, somebody came along and kind of pulled this man off of me, you know, aside, dragged him off, and by that time, if I wasn't crying, I felt I was crying inside. I was really scared. And after that, my parents told me that they wouldn't let me walk around the hotel or go places without Carolyn. We had to go together because, you know, at this big convention, even in the middle of the day, you might run into somebody that was obnoxious. And that was the first time I ever really remember feeling physically threatened by anybody. And it was a long time after that it ever happened again. I was an old married lady, so that was my first experience. But anyway, there were a lot of young folks from Texas, college people or young law school people. And it was fun for me to go and be with them. And I remember we go out at night, and I didn't, you could drink at 18, but I didn't care anything about any of it anyway. But they'd take me along, and I'd get to go, and Carolyn and I would go and feel like we were really grown-ups. And Shannon Ratliff was one of them, and there were a lot of other nice young people. And some of the staff, some of the volunteers came out to California. And so the night of the balloting for president, after my father had lost, and Daddy, they had never really, made us think that he really was serious about it. I think he was pushed into a corner, and a lot of his supporters wanted him to run, and I think he probably recognized that he would not, if you had a Democrat in the White House, he wouldn't be as powerful and be able to do some of the things he was able to do. So anyway, that night, after he lost, after the balloting, and those were the wonderful days where at conventions you had speeches, you had nominating speeches, you had a lot of hoopla and people marching around, cheering for you and supporting, and all that was very exciting. And then, but after he'd lost, I remember my first time going out and making a speech, I went out to the tent, to this place where our loyal supporters, our closest campaign people were gathered. And Daddy and Mother, I don't know what they were doing, but they were probably doing something very important. But I went out there and made a speech and told about how when Daddy had lost his first race, he had said, we'll play this game again, and used a baseball analogy, and there'll be other times, and try to kind of cheer him up. Well, the next day, after the nomination, I went to Mother and I said, well, is there any reason why I need to stay around here? And Mother said, no, nothing's going to go on. I mean, they're going to nominate the vice president today, but there's no need for you to be around. And so Carolyn and I, and two young men, one of whom was a friend of mine, the other one was probably some California person, I don't remember. But anyway, somebody had a car, and we rode out to Disneyland, and that was very exciting. We'd always heard about Disneyland, and actually I had gone there with Daddy after he had his heart attack. He had taken, the four of us had gone, and Daddy didn't take us on trips much. So anytime we got to go on something like that, it was really special. The only other one I remember is when one spring Easter vacation, Sid Herlong, I think that was his name, he was a congressman from Florida. He had invited a bunch of people to come down to Daytona Beach, I think it was Daytona Beach, for spring break. And so the four Johnsons went, the Congressman Thornberry and his wife and children went. There was at least one or two other Texas congressmen who went along, and it was great fun. But we didn't really take those kind of family vacations very much, and so each one we treasured. Well, I was going to take advantage of being here in California and LA, and I'd been busy with the convention and doing all of my thing, and now that we were out of it, I could be free to go and see Disneyland. And I asked Mother, would it be all right to go? And she said, oh yes, it'd be fine. And so we went to Disneyland. And we probably got there in the middle of the day, I don't know. And I went and checked in. I went to whatever they call their city hall, and I said, I'm Senator Johnson's daughter, and I just want to check in, I'm telling you I'm here in case you need to get in touch with me. So, and I went around and we rode all the rides and everything. Well, it got to be dark, and I went and, I'd never heard anything. Nobody they had I remember distinctly that they, from time to time, would make announcements over the PA system. So I kind of got interested about who was going to be picked. Who do they pick for vice president? And I went to one of the guards, the police there, and I said, has anybody heard, or maybe I went back to City Hall, I can't remember, but I went and asked. No, nobody had heard about who had been chosen vice president. So I said, okay. So finally, and it got to be probably by then maybe 7 o'clock, anyway, it was later, and I found this policeman, and I said, has anybody heard who was chosen? And he said, well, I think it was Johnson. I said, no, it couldn't have been Johnson. Couldn't have been Johnson. I'm his daughter. I would have been called. I know. I told these people where I was going to be, and I know that my parents would have tried to reach me. And he said, well, I think that's who it was, but I'm not sure. So I kept saying, no, I know, you know. And then they kind of got suspicious. Well, oh yeah, sure, you're Senator Johnson's daughter. I said, oh yes, I am, see? See right here, this is my cross that my grandmother, Daddy's mother, Made, gave me. And she'd given me this cross when I was confirmed in 1957. And so, you know, here it is, see, Lynda Bird Johnson. Well, I convinced this person at least I was Lynda Bird Johnson, and they had heard that LBJ stuff before about the same initials. So, anyway, well, I called back, finally got through to somebody, and to be honest, I cannot remember if I really got through to my mother or daddy or who. But, of course, I heard, much to my chagrin, that Daddy had been picked and that they had been looking for me. And they said that they had called Disneyland and asked to have me paged, and that I had never, you know, responded. And Carolyn and I knew that they had never done it, and we felt that it was probably a Republican plot because Walt Disney was a Republican, and he had just wanted, you know, probably to embarrass me. But I was very upset. And then when I got my father on the phone, he said something to the effect of, I didn't send you out there to go to Disneyland, bring you out here to California to go to Disneyland. And I said, and this is another example of that brashness that got me in trouble. And maybe he said it, did you think I brought you out here to go? But whatever I responded was, well, I didn't think we came out here to be nominated for vice president either. Because, of course, all along the way they had said, oh no, he would never take it, no. Because, you know, when we'd been with the Kennedy people, they would say, well, you know, your person can be vice president, will be president. And I'd say, no, Daddy will be president and your person can be vice president. So that was very, very embarrassing for me, and I don't ever want to tell the story about how I was lost at Disneyland, but the truth is I was there, and I very much resent the fact that they didn't find me. So I went back kind of in very embarrassing circumstances and having to make excuses about why I wasn't there. Meanwhile, Lucy, of course, just in all her glory, just marched right up to the podium and was the favored child, and I was not even the prodigal daughter. I was just out of the whole picture. I was so bad that I missed it. And I thought, well, you know, we didn't come out here. I had to ask you if we were going to do anything with the vice presidency, and you said, no, Mother, you said to go. And, you know, I felt that I'd been cheated out of something, but anyway, it was one of the funny things that did happen out there. And then, many years later, in 1973, I guess it was, or 72, I don't really quite remember what year, they opened Disney World. And I got invited to go to the kind of advance, the preview. And we had all sorts of fancy people. Nixon was president then, and Ehrlichman and Haldeman were there. And I remember Mr. Haldeman with his movie camera and taking film of everything. And I had had this terrible accident and had broken my neck. But Chuck had said to me, you know, when you get well, we'll go to Disney World. And it was like lures. I mean, you know, I was finally going to get to go back to Disney something. This was Disney World in Florida, not Disneyland in California. But I was going to finally get to go back to this Disney experience in glory, having been there in such ignominy, or whatever you pronounce that word. And I went and had a wonderful time. So I have to laugh and think that maybe the Disneys were just trying to pay me back for what they did those years and years before. It caused me such pain. So that was my funny story about what happened to me at the convention. I think Lucy, instead, she went off to the racetrack with the Wesley West. But I think that they found her and got her back in time. And I was just, didn't have a grown-up with me who got through and found me.
Funny story.
Oh, it's terrible. It's terrible.
Were
Yes?
you impressed by the fact that your father was high in the government? You were aware of that throughout your life, but did it impress you?
Well, I mean, I knew that was my daddy's job. And Daddy and Mother always used to say, we're not important, it's the job that's important. And they did not want us to go around and say, listen, I can do that because don't you know who I am? And we did have one friend. One time we went off somewhere, and our family with another family. And in this case, this was in the summer, and a member of this family that we were doing things with, we came upon, we wanted to shoot pool, to play billiards in this place, or maybe it was ping pong, but whatever it was a community hall, and it was just us children. And we went in, and I waited my turn, and this person got anxious and said, tried to take the game over and say, don't you know who we're here? You know who we are? We're here with Senator Johnson. And that's not at all what my father would have liked for us to do. Now, I did not do it. It was this other person. And I was kind of horrified. But I do know that, for instance, I got to, probably park my car. I guess I was old enough to drive, just barely, at the Capitol. Or I got to come into the Senate office building and really basically run all over and go places that other people didn't, because I was Senator Johnson's daughter. And so in that sort of way, I think I probably recognized how important he was and so forth. But in those days, even being the vice president's daughter didn't make you a big person and important. I mean, there were certain things that I got to do. For instance, when I tell my story, tell my children about how I was the Duchess of Texas at the Yam Festival in Gilmer. They laugh, and I know for sure that the reason why I got to do that was it was 1960, and Gilmer was in Deep East Texas, and we were trying to reach out to those people who were not as happy that Lyndon Johnson had gone on the ticket with this Catholic, who they also thought was going to shove integration down their throats. And so I was kind of a nice, easy way to say, look, we care about you. And then the same thing. In 1961, after Daddy was vice president, I was asked by, I'm sure, Senator Byrd, invited to go and be the Azalea Queen in Norfolk. And as my children would say about themselves later on, as governor's children, we were not chosen for either our baton twirling or in the swimsuit contest. You know, it was strictly because of who your father was. And so yes, there were certain perks, but I think Daddy just didn't even think in terms of those things. The perk that he thought he gave us was letting us come down and see the State of the Union. Or when we had something particularly exciting going on, he would get us out of class to come down. And I expect that we're not as excited about what was going on the floor as we were of getting out of class, missing school to go down to the Capitol, and that was a big perk. That was a treat that we got to do that. But I do remember I think it was Saturday, and I can't imagine, I guess they must have worked on Saturdays and weekends in those days, because I was down there all the time folding mail or running errands and doing things for the office. And maybe it was in the summer, I don't know. But I remember my father taking me, we were going in what is now called the Russell office building. It was this Senate office building then. But, and maybe could it have been called just the old Senate office building? But whatever. Going in a certain door, I remember going in there and Daddy introducing me, taking me in that door because he saw Senator Taft going in. And Senator Taft had cancer at that time. And Daddy knew he was not going to live very long. And Daddy took me and introduced me to him and said, I want you to meet this great man. I want you to have the opportunity to say, I met Bob Taft. And he was very cognizant of history and how, even though at this age, I wasn't going to appreciate it, that maybe I would remember it. And I remember the door we went in. You know, I have this, there's no photograph of it, but I can see it right now, exactly where it was and how it happened. So, the other funny thing I have to tell you about, Daddy was very naive and just kind of out to lunch on some areas. But one summer, Dale Miller, he represented Dallas. And the word got around that he was going to bring Jane Mansfield, who was from Dallas, up to meet Daddy. Well, Daddy didn't know Jane Mansfield from Adam's House Cat. You know, he never went to movies. He had no idea who she was. But I remember how all the twittering, all the staff thought this was just fascinating, you know. And here it was in July, and Jane Mansfield came in this sweater. You can guess why. But, you know, wearing a sweater in Washington in the summer? You know, it was before air conditioning, and we were all trying to get put on as little as possible, and here she had this sweater on. So she really was a rara arwist, or however you pronounce it, a rare bird, to be wearing a sweater. But Daddy didn't know who she was at all, and so we thought that was very funny. Have I told you everything? Can you think of anything you want to ask me?
Well, I was gone, but I want to know, if you haven't already done it, I think you ought to address the question of how you hope your mother will be remembered.
Well, I think definitely that Mother was always the supreme helpmate. She made it possible for Daddy to do what he did. All the good things, anyway. She provided the financial resources, and believe me, we're seeing that more and more now in the Congress, that people cannot afford to be in Congress unless they have a spouse who is able to raise outside money, or unless they just are independently wealthy to begin with. But it's not just that women, and it's a lot still, far too many women as the spouses, but that that they all want to go work and have these jobs and careers, but it would be very difficult in these times to be a member of Congress if you didn't have someone to pay the bills. And Mother did that. I remember that Mother would receive these big bundles of information from KTBC in the olden days. And she had an office. She had a room right next to Daddy's, right off their bedroom, and she would go in there and she'd read all these things. And then she would leave and go to Texas to work on the station, as she would say, to work with Jesse Kellum. And so it was not just Daddy's career, his politics that took her away, but it was also, she was a businesswoman and she had to go down there. And then when I got to be old enough to have any job at the radio station, I went, and they gave me several different jobs so I could kind of learn the business, what was going on. So financially, Mother made it possible. And then, of course, she was the glue. She was the one that went around and kept everybody together. When Daddy would get out of sorts with somebody, she would go kind of ruffle. She tried to smooth all the feathers. And I once asked her, I said, well, tell me what you did for Daddy politically. And that's what she said. She said, I followed behind him and made up for everything. She didn't say it quite that way, but that was the gist of it. She basically said, I wasn't out there making policy decisions for him and making great speeches. I was there trying to keep everybody happy, both with his staff and with all of his supporters. And I think that connection is a very important thing that we also have lost in this society, because so many women are working, that we're basically the ones that organize people over for dinner, that figure out how we can all bring everybody together and working, and our connection with what's going on in our civic work. And Mother did that. She was very involved in everything from collecting for March of Dimes in our neighborhood to going to our Girl Scout things. And so she did do a lot of Mother things that she doesn't get credit for. But she also was with him a lot. So that was something that she did. And she, most of all, gave him very, very good judgment. She was his anchor. There might be people who would tell him things because it was in their best interest, or tell him things that he wanted to hear. But she was the one who told him what she really thought was right. And he trusted her. He knew she had good judgment. And he also knew that she didn't have an agenda of her own. Now, there were a few agendas. I cannot tell you that my mother was perfect. And that's one of the things. He would laugh. He would say, be like your mother. Say, she never gossips. He just didn't know. She also loved to hear a little gossip, and she was willing to, and only in the kindest way. But, he was just completely oblivious to some of the things that were going on around him. And she kind of kept up with what was going on, and was wonderful in networking with the other spouses. And that's one of the things we've lost now in the Congress, that there is no networking. People don't get together. And when I look back and I see the relationship that Daddy had with a lot of Republicans, a lot of people that were very, very different than he was, different backgrounds, different education, different parts of the country, different interests, I see that my mother helped make all of these people get along better. And that's another very, very valuable thing that I think she did for him. She networked, and if you're going to Bible study with somebody's wife, then you may look upon them and think, well, at least he has a nice wife. He couldn't be that bad because she married him, that kind of thing. And I think that Mother provided a lot of that also. But after Daddy died, you know, there were a lot of things that Daddy